Hi, my name is Lauren Morgan, and my project is on the impact of protective and risk factors on adolescent responses to COVID-19. So since the outbreak of COVID-19 on December 31st, 2019, there have been almost 121 million cases and 3 million deaths reported worldwide. Now, when looking at these numbers, it's essential to identify what populations have the greatest impact over the spread of this virus. Adolescents are prime asymptomatic carriers because they have lower mortality rates and experience less severe symptoms. This makes early identification and isolation harder, and therefore their adherence to preventative measures plays a major role in the course of the pandemic. So this led me to investigate what factors have affected adolescent responses to COVID-19 and how we can learn from the current situation to better prepare for future health crises. So before moving on, it's important to understand what a protective and risk factor is. In this context, a protective factor would help mitigate COVID-19 and a risk factor would help encourage the spread of COVID-19. Within the past year, many protective factors, risk factors, and responses have been studied among adolescents. A U.S. study found that high perception of COVID-19 severity, social responsibility values, social trust, and self-interest were associated with news monitoring, social distancing, and disinfecting behaviors. Participants who reported greater severity of COVID-19, less social responsibility, less social trust, and greater self-interest also reported more hoarding. Meanwhile, a Chinese study found that resilience and positive coping methods resulted in less depression, anxiety, stress, and trauma-related distress. Meanwhile, negative coping strategies were associated with increased depression, anxiety, stress symptoms, and trauma-related distress. And lastly, a Nepal study found that protective factors listed here, there are quite a few, so I'm not going to list them, were identified as positive influences on mental health, while the risk factors were identified as negative influences on mental health. And if you look at them, you can see they're a lot more specific than the ones from the two studies mentioned above. But the purpose of my research is to better understand how certain protective and risk factors have impacted adolescent responses to COVID-19, suggest ways in which adolescents can shift the course of COVID-19, and use the data to help prepare for future health crises. So the variables I chose, there were limitless I could study, but for my protective factors, I chose to study family responses, basically our household members adhering to CDC guidelines, and community satisfaction. Basically, since the beginning of COVID-19, has it increased, decreased, or stayed the same? For my risk factor, I chose to study risk perception, basically how severe do adolescents perceive COVID-19 to be. And then lastly, for my responses, I decided to measure individual adherence to CDC guidelines and depressive symptoms. And also, due to the nature of this survey research, no control groups or variables were necessary. So, my hypotheses. So, I hypothesized that increased household adherence to CDC health guidelines will result in increased individual adherence to CDC health guidelines because adolescents are likely to adopt the behaviors of surrounding figures. Meanwhile, I hypothesized that increased satisfaction with communities will result in increased individual adherence to CDC guidelines and decreased depressive symptoms because social trust and community structure are supported COVID-19 protective factors. And then lastly, I hypothesized that increased risk perception of COVID-19 will result in increased individual adherence to CDC health guidelines because greater risk perception will yield greater precautionary behavior, but then it will also yield increased depressive symptoms. My methods, fairly simple. Basically gather my participants, have them fill and sign the human consent form, administer the survey, and then collect and analyze the data. And the survey had a pretty simple structure. The first section was collecting data on the sample. So there were some demographical questions along with individual and family COVID-19 positivity question and trust of COVID-19 information sources. And then the other three sections were, as I discussed before, based on those two factors and then the responses. My sample characteristics, just some quick descriptive details on the sample. Overall, there was good representation within the sample. If I were to continue data collection, I would hope to see some gender and race even out a little more. I did run an ANOVA test on these demographics and the survey responses. However, the value is too insignificant to draw any conclusions. But on the top here, we can see that most individuals do not have underlying health conditions, which is expected in this sample population. However, it was striking to see that about half of the participants have household members with underlying health conditions, so that could certainly affect their adherence to precautionary measures. On the bottom, we see a small percentage of participants who had contracted COVID-19 and a little bit greater percentage of participants whose family members contracted COVID-19, but again, the statistical analyses didn't indicate any significance. Lastly, I included a question to evaluate COVID-19 information sources, and this would be an interesting point to evaluate as a protective or risk factor. But for this study, overall scientific agencies such as like the CDC were trusted the most, which makes sense. So, quickly to go over kind of more the raw data. So I found that overall there was a high frequency of household adherence to CDC guidelines, a small change in community satisfaction, and medium COVID-19 risk perception. I also found that there was a high frequency of individual adherence to CDC guidelines, and this could be expected because students are required to wear masks on campus. However, outside of school, they have a little more autonomy. And then lastly, depression was measured using the PHQ-9 scale, and this scale is really well established and commonly used. So unlike the other scales, which were on a 5-point Likert scale, this one ranged from 0 to 27 because it was a cumulative score. So yeah, but more importantly, the relationships observed. So using the Pearson correlation coefficient, I found that household adherence to CDC guidelines was positively correlated with individual adherence to CDC guidelines. As you can see from the graph here, there's a strong correlation with an R value of 0.830. I also found that increased community satisfaction was correlated with decreased individual adherence to CDC guidelines with an R value of negative 0.150. Now, this negative correlation is minimal because the line here is pretty shallow, but it suggests that those who have increased satisfaction within their communities are less prudent with precautionary measures because they may be resistant to the constricted social environment. And then on the right here, the data points are clearly much more scattered. However, there was a mild to moderate negative correlation with an R value of negative 0.212. And you can see that the line of best fit is a little steeper and that increased community satisfaction was associated with decreased depressive symptoms. Lastly, the first graph on the left here depicts COVID-19 risk perception minimally correlated with increased individual adherence to CDC guidelines with an R value of 0.131, and all the data points can be seen lying in the upper half of this graph. So regardless of perceived risk level, so this is also expected because masks are mandated in school and many other public environments. Lastly here, I found a positive correlation between risk perception and depression. The data points are extremely scattered, as you can see, but the R value was 0.282, so a moderate association, and this relationship is logical because those who perceive greater COVID-19 risk would experience more anxiety, sadness, and other depressive symptoms. So my main conclusions. So household adherence to CDC guideline plays a protective role in individual adherence to CDC guidelines, which supports my hypothesis. So this just reinforces that household behavior should model proper precautionary health measures for adolescents to adopt. Meanwhile, community satisfaction acted as a risk factor for individual adherence to CDC guidelines, which actually refuted my hypothesis. So it's crucial that communities emphasize health guidelines and model consistent behavior for adolescents. I also found that community satisfaction acted as a protective factor against depression, which supported my hypothesis, and therefore a sense of community is important to maintain in crises, especially over an extended period like this one. And then for risk perception, I found that it played a protective role in individual adherence to CDC guidelines, which supported my hypothesis. So the spread of accurate information regarding severity of diseases and symptoms are vital in the current and future health crises. And then lastly, risk perception is a risk factor when it comes to depression, which also supported my hypothesis. So it's essential that mental health resources are easily accessible to adolescents along with all age groups. But overall, consistent science-based messaging and a coherent plan is necessary to produce mitigating behaviors among adolescents to ultimately reduce the spread of contagions. Some limitations: I was able to get 68 participants in this sample, but even more participants would have yielded more significant results. Additionally, the data sample at Sarasota High School isn't fully representative of adolescents nationwide, so data collection across all 50 states would provide much more insight into nationwide responses among adolescents. And then I would also be interested in exploring other protective and risk factors along with other responses, so that would be fascinating as well. And here are my references. Thank you.